10,000 feet high at Alma in the Atacama Desert. And you could see the Milky Way arching overhead. And what strikes you is that the Atacamanians did not have constellations the way we have them. They didn't see patterns in the stars. They didn't connect the dots. What they saw was the dark structures in the Milky Way. And in those dark structures, those shadow areas that could only be seen under the pristine dark skies, in those dark structures, we see the llama, see? We see the mother llama over here, and we see the baby llama suckling underneath. Their constellations were not just the llama, but you have the llama, the baby llama, there's a shepherd, there's a fox, there's a toad, a partridge, and a snake, all within the bands of the Milky Way galaxy. And their stories revolved around these creatures, and they say it's a river, and the creatures drink from the river, and it's the stories they tell in the sky. Even when you go to the streets, in San Pedro de Atacama, which is a tourist town, almost every corner, every shop has astronomy tours being advertised. Go out to the desert, they say, look at the stars, look at the constellations, and everywhere we see the same motifs over here of the dark Milky Way with the llama in the sky. And in all of these stores, and in all of their tourist stores, they have them with the stars and the Milky Way and their constellations. You could buy souvenirs, you could buy hats, you could buy, anything. And it really, really struck me that these were people who understood their own indigenous astronomy and their own culture, and they kept that connection alive. And then there was me thinking, well, what about back home? Because we come from a place where there were indigenous cultures as well. Trinidad and Tobago, this soil had hosted many, many, many peoples before the Europeans and before they brought the slaves and the indentured workers. So what about our indigenous astronomy? And so I went off on a search and a quest. I couldn't come back from Chile and not dig into our, and lucky for me, in my work life, in my day-to-day job, I'm a printer. And I had the pleasure of working with one Dr. Maura P. Imbert, recently passed away, God rest her soul, a shining light, a towering pillar of astronomy in Trinidad and Tobago. She was the president of the Trinidad and Tobago Astronomical Society for decades, a true giant. And one of the books that she was working on, that she printed with us, is Taino Stars Over Greencastle Hill. And she had done this as part of her master's research program, where she went to Antigua and looked at stone formations on Greencastle Hill and made a connection between the Taino people and the astronomy. So I had a starting point, and I went through her bibliographies, and I started finding books and papers and articles. And what I have for you today is a small selection of the culture and the stories and the star lore of the peoples that would have inhabited this area before us. So the Caribbean was comprised of many, many groups of peoples, right? But broadly, there were Arawakan languages up to the top and Caribbean languages to the south. But there were many different tribes within those language groups. Trinidad in particular is a funny place because there was many, many different tribes represented here, whereas in most places they would tend to be dominated by one tribe or the other. So what we found is that the astronomies between these various groups are very similar. Because they lived close together, they intermarried, they shared a lot of their stories. So their astronomies are very, very similar between the Arabs, the Arawaks, etc. So we could substitute one for the other. In mid-northern latitudes, the sky is dominated by rotation around Polaris. Polaris, the pole star, sits high in the sky, and all the stars rotate around it. But that's not so here in the Caribbean. Here in the Caribbean, stars rise in the east and set in the west. It's a linear motion. It's not a radial, circular motion. And so the ancient peoples viewed the sky more as in a rectangular way rather than a circular way. And we'll get back to that when we get to our first story. By far, the most important group of stars to the inhabitants of this area, the Kalinagos and the Tainos and the Arawakan groups. By far the most important group of stars is a little cluster called it's one of the largest clusters that we could see, called the Pleiades, or the Seven Sisters. This group of stars is usually very visible around this time of the year. It's something that we tend to look at Star Party all the time. Guys, we're watching the sprinkles, right? So we're hoping that it doesn't get much heavier than this, so I'm going to continue going until we feel that it's going to start getting a little heavier, right? So this is the Pleiades, or the Seven Sisters. And the Arawaks, they used this group of stars to mark the beginning of the year. They used this to tell when they were going to start the agricultural cycle, when they were going to cut the fields to plant new crops. But also, in order to remember and in order for the knowledge to pass, they told stories about it. So I'm going to tell you the most popular story told by the tribes about the Pleiades. Now, remember, there are many stories from many tribes, but they're all sort of interlinked. And what I'm going to give you is the most popular one. And it has to do with a lady called Siritjo, her husband, Epitimbo, and a tapir. Now, a tapir is an animal. It's the biggest mammal that you would find in the South American sort of jungle. And it's like a pig with a snout. Now, I'm just going to say the illustrations that I have here are all AI generated. So take it with a grain of salt, please. This is just for entertainment purposes. There's nothing accurate about these, right? But Siritjo was a young lady, recently married to the great hunter Epitimbo, one of the greatest hunters of that village. Now, she went to plant her cassava fields one day, and what approached her was a tapir, a fairly large tapir. And strangely enough, the tapir could speak, because the tapir was really a man who had taken the form of a tapir so that he could approach her safely, because he was in love with her, and she was married. So he came to her as a tapir, and he started speaking with her. And at first she didn't want to speak with him, but eventually, after several days and days and weeks, she started growing fond of this tapir. And he asked her to run away with him. He said, go east with me. We'll keep going east. We'll go east, we'll go east, we'll go east, and eventually we'll come to the end of the world. And there we could be together forever. And she told him, I don't think so. I have a life here. And he said, don't worry. He took her axe and he sharpened it and put a spell on it. And he said, this will protect you, but you take your time. Now, Siritjo one day was at home with Epitimbo, her husband, and he said to her, we need to collect some zaboka, avocados, right? Zaboka. So they went up to a zaboka tree, and he said, I'm going to climb the tree, and you collect the firewood. These are all important details, okay? We'll get to them later. So they're climbing he's going to climb the zaboka tree, and she's going to collect firewood, right? She had the axe with her to collect the firewood. And when Epitimbo was coming down from the tree with his zabokas in his hand, she swung the axe and chopped his leg clean off. And she ran, and she ran, and she ran. Epitimbo doesn't understand what's going on, but he plucks an eyelash and blows it into the wind, and it becomes a bird. And he tells the bird to go back to the village and find my mother. And the bird does that. And his mother comes and nurses him back to health, and he gets a pair of crutches so he could start moving again. And he says, I need to go and look for my wife. I need to find my wife. But now the rains had come, and now the ground is muddy, and it's hard to track, but he did it anyway. And he searched, and he searched, and he searched. And then one day, eventually, he found an avocado sapling growing out of the ground. And he knew his wife had avocados with her. And he said, oh, she must have been eating them, and dropped the seeds on the ground, and they're growing into trees. And so he started in the direction of the avocado sapling. And then he found another one. And then he found another one, and he knew he was on the right track. Eventually, he saw their tracks in front of him. And almost at the edge of the earth, he came upon them. And he saw that she was with the tapir. And he being a big hunter, immediately went after the tapir with bow and arrow, with spear, and he fought the tapir, killed him. Cut his head off. And then he told his wife, "We could come back with me now." And she says, "No, I don't want to go back with you." And she ran eastwards, and she ran with the tapir's spirit, his spirit that left his dead body. And she reached the end of the earth, and she threw herself up into the sky. And the tapir's spirit followed her up into the sky. And Epitimbo, going after his wife, ran after them, and he himself jumped up into the sky. And now, today, you could see them chasing each other across the sky. You and I, we know them as the constellations of the Pleiades, the Hyades in Taurus, and Orion, the mighty hunter of Greek mythology, but to the Arabs, Epitimbo, with one leg. Amerindians. So this here is Sirijo, the woman, Maipuri, the tapir, and Epitimbo, the hunter. And they travel together in the sky, moving east to west, one chasing the other. Now, it also marks the seasons, you see, because when Sirijo rises first thing in the morning, the helical rising of the Pleiades, it marks the time when we need to clear and plant. And that's why we see in the story, she was off to plant her cassava fields. When Maipuri is around, that's when the rains come. And we saw in the story, the tracks were muddied when she ran off with him, and the place was flooded and it was rainy. And then when Orion rises, it's time when the fruits are ripening, and we saw it with the avocados being grown, the saplings growing out of the ground. So these stories serve multiple purposes. You learn the sky, you have a calendar, but also it teaches you morality, and then it tells you how to go about planting, what happens when, where what happens. So these stories and this understanding of the astronomy wove through the very fabric of their society. So I have another story now. This time from the central Arawaks. These are the Arawaks living in the Guyana Highlands, right? And they have a particular story about two twins, the sons of the sun. So the sun had two children, and these were the two twins. And their names were, let me get this right, Duid and Tuminkar. Now, Duid and Tuminkar was the older one, and Duid was the younger one. They're twins, but one comes out slightly before the other, right? And Tuminkar planted a great tree. Now, this is a silk cotton tree. It's particularly a silk cotton tree. And I want you guys to get that, right? Even the Amerindians had the same fascination with the silk cotton tree that we have with it today. So Tuminkar planted a giant silk cotton tree, right? And on this giant silk cotton tree grew almost any fruit and food and any type of sustenance you could think of. Everything was growing on this one tree. And the younger twin, Duid, he would take the food from the tree and give it to the people, give it to the Amerindian people, right? And they didn't have to work. They didn't have to do anything. The food came to them. But when you have nothing to do, you just get bored. So the people and them got bored. And they decided, they saw all the animals going in one direction and coming back every day. And they decided to follow the animals. And when they followed the animals, they found the tree. They found the great tree of life. And they said, now we know where the tree is. We can get this food for ourselves. We do not need you, Duid and Tuminkar, to help us, and we do not need to be grateful to you. We could get the food ourselves. Yeah. Well, Duid got very angry. He got very angry because he said the people were being ungrateful. So he said, fine, you want to get the food yourself? He chopped down the tree, destroyed it completely. And the tree came down with a great crash and unleashed water. But he told them, go now and collect the pieces on the ground. Collect the branches, collect the saplings, collect the fruit. What you collect, you could carry it back home and plant it, and it will grow. But it will only grow that one thing. It wouldn't grow everything like this tree. But if you plant, if you collect, and you take care of it, you could have all these things to eat. But the people were not able, they weren't industrious enough, they weren't hardworking enough to collect all. And even the ones that they did collect, they weren't hardworking enough to take care of it. And so eventually we only had a few good things to eat. And that is how they have food today. And it was very hard to plant and very hard to work. But when the tree fell down with a crash and unleashed water, it created the Amazon River. And the Amazon River reflected in the sky as the Milky Way. So we see here the creation of the Milky Way galaxy, what we know as the Milky Way galaxy, but to them, it was a river in the sky, a reflection of the Amazon, and was associated with water. And when the Milky Way would come down low, the water on Earth would rise. And so they understood it as a river in the sky. Interestingly, in the Milky Way, this is one of the images I took in Chile as well, of the central part of the Milky Way. And we could see here the dark areas where was the llama and the baby llama, but the Amerindians, they saw in it a tapir and a jaguar. So they had the same ideas of looking for dark structure in the Milky Way as the Atacamanians, but for them, it was based on animals that were relevant to them. So I have one more story, and this one is Umbatopo. I'm not an expert in Arawakan languages, so please forgive the pronunciations. But this was a great-grandmother, and some have her being the mother-in-law of Epitimbo the hunter. But she was very hungry because her children were taking long to come back with the food. Her son and her daughter were taking long to come back with the food. So she went to her son's fish trap and stole some of his fish. Now, when the son came home and he learned of it, he was very angry. Because don't mind he taking long to come home, you're not supposed to steal. So he was very, very upset. So he went to the water spirit. He went to the water spirit, Okoyumo, and he told him what had happened. And the water spirit told him, okay, you send your mother-in-law back to collect some fish from the trap tomorrow, and I will take matters into my hand. And so the son went back and he told his mother-in-law the next day, go down to the river and fetch my fish trap. And so she did. But when she went there, Okoyomo had summoned a whole school of pataka fish, what we call in Trinidad wabin. And the school of wabin started attacking her. And so she fled up into the sky in order to escape them. And from her, we have the constellation of the Face. Now this constellation here, we know it as Canis Major. But to the Amerindians, it was the constellation of the Face. And I will attempt to show it to you here, where we could see the Face. Now, this is the bright star Sirius. It's the brightest star in the sky. And we see this as the big dog, Canis Major. But to the Atacamanians, it was the Face. And this, when it rose, this told when time was good for fishing. Because the streams were drying up. And because the streams were drying up, the fish were bundled together and you could catch them easily. So again, the story about the fishing, and the story is she takes her revenge on the fish by drying up the rivers. She takes her revenge on the fish by drying up the rivers, and it makes it easy to catch them. So again, you have these stories where there's a morality involved, and there's lessons in the story to learn. But also, it tells you about how the seasons work and how the animals work and their feeding and their behaviors, so you're able to catch them. I just have one or two more to show you. This is the Big Dipper, Ursa Major, as we see it from here in the Caribbean, upside down. To the Amerindians, it was the canoe and the heron, right? It's the heron riding the canoe. And this, again, was associated with rainfall. When it goes down, it's associated with the increase in rains. And now, the last one I want to show you. This one is very, very interesting because it shows you the depth to which they understood astronomy and the depth to which they understood the Earth. So here we have Sirius, part of the constellation, the Face, and they call it Maliribana, and Procyon, they call it the other Maliribana. But Sirius and Procyon tend to come up almost at the same time. But this star, Sirius, the Amerindians, the Caribs, particularly the Caribs of Dominica for sure, but pretty much all of them, they associated this star with disaster. And they associated this star with bad things. They had a saying, the return of the dog star, we call it the dog star Sirius, Maliribana, the return of Maliribana is unhealthy because it was associated with this figure over here, who is called Wabanchex. This is the goddess who, among her servants, is Huracan. Huracan. What does that sound like? Huracan. This is the god associated with hurricanes. And the Amerindians were astute enough to know that with the helical rising of Sirius, the dog star, Maliribana, was the start of the hurricane season. And so they would know what types of trips to go on and whether to set out with their canoes or not, depending on when the star was in the sky, because when that star was in the sky, it meant that hurricanes could come. So they understood the hurricane season, and they understood how the stars were associated with it. And so they didn't have need for the National Science Center and the National Hurricane Center up in Miami, and they just looked at the stars and they knew what could be done and what could not be done. And this demonstrates to me more than anything else the depth of their perceptiveness about the night sky and the world that we live in. So guys, there are ancient astronomies all over the world that are celebrated. Stonehenge in England, Chichen Itza in Mexico. And I'm saying to you that we here in the Caribbean, and particularly here in Trinidad and Tobago, we have stories and legends of astronomies that we can celebrate. This here is a structure that sits in Laventille. They call it Fort Chacon. It is not a fort. It is an observatory made by the astronomer Don Shuraka, who came here to establish the first line of longitude in the Western Hemisphere ever. The first line of longitude ever established in the Western Hemisphere was done from Trinidad on the hills of Laventille. And we are also host to the Caribbean and Arawak tribes, the Kalinago, the Yao, all these different groups that existed here. And these had amazing star lore and astronomies and a very firm understanding of the relationship between man and the world that we live in and the skies overhead. And to me, I think it is definitely worthy of being proud of as a people coming from this land, and definitely something that we should all celebrate. So ladies and gentlemen, that is my message here for you this evening. Thank you much for being a wonderful audience, and do have a wonderful rest of the Star Party. Despite the clouds, we're still here to have a good time. So thank you all so very much.